This lecture is about strategies to increase both amounts of practice and intensity of practice in stroke rehab. So I'll cover some of the research evidence and look at what that means in terms of some of the practical strategies we can use to increase intensity and amounts of practice. So starting with amounts of practice, first of all, we need to be very critical about the way we deliver our service. So if we are only setting up patients' practice into one-to-one practice that they do with us during a therapy session, then that's just not ever going to achieve enough practice to really make a big difference to people's outcomes. So we can think about dividing people's practice into one-to-one, semi-supervised and independent. So I'll go through and think about each of those. So in one-to-one, that means that the therapist is working directly with the stroke survivor. And that should only be done when it needs to be done. We don't need a lot of practice to be one-to-one practice. If you need to be there to set up the environment, to help progress somebody's practice, to give them some very specific feedback because they're just trying to get the idea of what it is that they're doing, then sure, you need to be there. But the minute that that practice is set up, then you should walk away and leave the person to practice and go and work with somebody else, because that means that that person learns to work without a therapist, and really increases their self-efficacy around their practice. I realize that a lot of therapy is structured and paid for too, if it's in a private context, as one-to-one therapy. But even within those models, I think we can be very inventive. For a period of time when I worked in an outpatient rehab setting, where the traditional model was people coming in for 1-hour appointments, I canned that very quickly, and instead of having somebody come in at 9 o'clock, somebody at 10 o'clock, somebody at 11 o'clock, I would suggest to those 3 people that they all come in for 3 hours of therapy, and that I'd be working with them and they'd be doing some work on their own. And that way those people get to do 3 hours of therapy instead of 1 hour of therapy. There's a private practice in Sydney, what has a few clinics around Australia, and they have workstations, so people don't sit in a waiting area when they come in. They can do some semi-supervised practice before and after their one-to-one session. In Australia, even within National Disability Insurance Scheme funding model, there is funding for running classes with 3 people. So I think we really need to look at how we get away from delivering therapy mostly as one-to-one, because it makes no sense to do that in terms of the amounts of practice people need to do. So in a therapy area, then, most therapy should be happening as semi-supervised practice. And that means that it's been set up maybe by the therapist or by family, and then that person then is practicing by themselves, or if they need some more help, could they be doing it with a family member? Groups and classes are a way to run a lot of semi-supervised practice, because people are not working. Part of it might be one-to-one, but most of it won't be. It'll be semi-supervised. So it's really practice that takes place in a therapy area. So there's some light supervision, but it's not one-to-one practice. And then independent, and by that we mean, things like home exercise programs, obviously the best example, but also within an inpatient setting. Independent practice can be, the practice that takes place outside of the therapy area, in people's bedrooms, etc. So we're going to think about the types of strategies that can be used to increase semi-supervised practice. So setting up an effective environment is critical. Running groups, so people practice together. Having families, and really, particularly in an inpatient setting, we should have people's families in there as much as possible to be creating extra practice opportunities. devices, particularly when people are very weak, having access to devices, and not necessarily big robotic devices, but sometimes just some easy, cheap devices too can make a big difference to people's access to doing semi-supervised practice, and workstations, because again, it's about just being able to set things up efficiently. So if we think firstly about the environment setup, you can see this man's not doing semi-supervised practice. He looks like he's got a therapist behind him, but you can see the environment setup means that he could very easily be doing semi-supervised practice. He's got a mark as to where his arm starts. He's got a cue as to where his arm moves to. And that means that that environment setup can drive semi-supervised practice. This person here has their practice modified, as their fingers are all taped together so they can move on block to make it easier for them so that they continue to practice without a therapist. And you could also, there's some marks that could be used there as to where his fingers and thumbs should land. And then another part of this setup is that he's getting feedback about how much force he's applying. So water coming up into this straw is giving him feedback. So if you've got some kind of environment set up that also has something that gives somebody some specific feedback, that can really help to make the practice more engaging as well. This person, again, you can see that it's set up, the practice is set up so that that's very clear to them where they start from, where they're going to. There's some instruction reminders there so that this person can really practice effectively, again, without having a therapist with them. Another example here, and so this could also be then translated into home exercise. So you can see the dot has to go to the can. The instructions are there in English and Chinese for the person to be able to read, but you can see fairly clear, simple instructions. Again, here, starting here, and that's where the cup should be moved to. There's track lines. That's the midline. That's where it should be placed. Track lines to keep the arm in between those two lines. So that very clear environment setup can be used to drive semi-supervised practice. Groups. So if you're not running any upper limb group, you should be. And really, unless you're working in people's houses, any other setting really can loan itself to running groups. And this is an example of a group in an inpatient rehab setting. This group was run 3 times a week by one OT and one physio, and anybody in the inpatient rehab setting who needed to do some upper limb practice would come to this group. So everybody coming to the group had a practice sheet so that if you weren't very familiar with them, that you could have a look at that practice sheet and see what their exercises were. And that meant it was very clearly laid out so that it could be run by people who weren't necessarily that familiar with all the stroke survivors that were coming to the group. But also that practice sheet meant that the practice could be recorded, the numbers of reps could be recorded. So here you can see Narelle doing some wrist extension to a clear target there. She's been set up to practice. She's got a counter to click her repetitions. This man is doing some forward flexion practice with a wheelie device going up the slope, so pushing up into forward flexion. This man is doing some practice taking a cup to his mouth, and he's got some electrical stim on at the same time. Avis here is lifting a can on and off another big can with a ball on top that gives her some feedback about whether she's maintaining her external rotation of her shoulder and her neutral position of her forearm. So, and again, she's got the clicker there so that she can keep track of her repetitions. Vinko here is doing an activity where he's putting that polystyrene cup on these various we'd call them like upside down cup things. But again, you can see it's very clear to him what the practice is, and all of these people are practicing without a therapist. So there's a therapist in the room, or two therapists in the room, but they're practicing and doing lots of reps without a therapist. George here has got a marker as to where the cup should land, and then he's practicing, grasping and transporting the cup. This guy's got, the therapist has come in to help set up his practice, but obviously once he's set up and ready to go, then she'll go off and help one of the other stroke survivors that might maybe need some setup, or maybe what would be really helpful in this kind of a group is that once everybody's set up to practice, that the therapists are either moving them on to the next exercise that they need to do, or maybe going in and measuring some knowledge of results feedback and recording that on their practice sheet as well as their repetitions. This is a study done by Emma Schneider, who's an OT in Melbourne. And what Emma was looking at in this study was changing the intensity of practice within an upper limb rehab class within an inpatient rehab setting. So you can see here that it's a 1-hour class, but at month 0, the time spent in practice was very low numbers of reps per minute, and less than a third of the hour spent actually practicing. So then they instituted a program of professional education, really upskilled the therapists as to how to set up active task practice and record practice as well too. And you can see at 12 months, they're now spending 84% of the time that they're in the class is practicing much higher numbers of repetitions. And 6 months after that, there is some drop off, but still nowhere near back to the very low baseline intensity of practice. So a really large increase in the amounts of practice achieved there because of a higher intensity. So really, you have a look at this: 2 reps per minute compared to 6 reps per minute. The intensity has tripled. Okay, families can also really help with semi-supervised practice, and especially upper limb practice. It's safe. You haven't got the worries that the physios have got about setting up lower limb practice, which has got much bigger safety concerns. But there might be some very specific skills that you really need to teach to the families to help make it successful. So you might need to really teach them some effective coaching. Don't talk all the time while Joe's practicing. Just give him the first instruction, and maybe just every now and then just remind him about this one thing. But then you just need to be quiet while he practices. And after he's done this many sets of practice, then remeasure this so that he gets some feedback. So you can teach the families those skills, as well as how to set up the environment, as well as things like using devices. So eSTIM devices, it's so easy to set up once people understand, just the basics of where to put them and setting and changing the intensity. So eSTIM devices, very good devices to set up for families to put on. And this kind of practice can really make a big difference to families' empowerment, particularly in an inpatient rehab setting. So about giving them advice about the best instructions and feedback to use. Now we're looking at devices. So this is a device that was made for us. The volume's pretty low, but can you hear that? So when she's achieved, it's counted down to 0. Started at 99, it's counted down to 0. And once it's got down to 0, then all the cars go racing around the car track. Rhonda, gets a bit excited about the whole thing, gets a bit of attention maybe around the group and stuff as well. So you can see she's not really doing very beautiful practice there, but you can see that there's just something about the device that really is going to make the practice more engaging. And so this device was made by a group of volunteers in New South Wales. We have a group called Technical Aids for the Disabled. and it's a group of retired tradesmen mostly who use their skills to make devices that you can't buy off the shelf. But I'm sure everybody's got access, surely, to people like that in your local men's sheds or whatever it might be. And you can imagine those kind of people with those kind of skills would be really engaged in thinking about inventive ways that they could help make devices that provide some feedback and maybe some excitement around people's practice. Now, this device was made by this lady's husband. And you can see here what it does is that you increase the amounts of practice again because it's more engaging. So what this very clever man has done is he's made this this wheelie sort of wooden platform with multi-directional wheels underneath it, and he's also made a casing that holds the computer mouse. So underneath that wooden platform, the computer mouse is sort of held in place, and it means that when this lady moves her arm, she moves the cursor and can play the game. So very, very, very neat setup there for playing a computer game with a very, very weak arm. So workstations. So, and this is really thinking about the context of when you think about semi-supervised practice, you need to be able to set it up very efficiently. If you're working across multiple people in the therapy area, and you can't find the equipment, and it takes you, 20 minutes to find stuff and set up somebody's practice, obviously that's not going to work very well. So you need to create efficiencies within your systems, having the equipment very much at hand. And that's the advantage of a workstation, really, is that it's all there in place, and people might be able to just access it themselves completely without you and set up their own practice, or maybe with family help. So this is an example of a very neat workstation that this photo was taken at Glostrup Rehabilitation Hospital in Copenhagen, and there's a great example of this at the Hamel Rehab Centre in Denmark, which is close to Aarhus. But you can see what's very clever about this is you have a wooden frame, and then you have these horizontal wooden slats, I guess you might call them, and each one contains a different type of activity. So this one's got some nuts and bolts, this one's got glass jars, this one's got plastic containers, and these can be slotted in at a particular height, so in close or further away or much further away if you want lots of forward flexion as well. So having workstations like this is really going to help set up practice very, very efficiently. Okay, and now thinking about amounts of practice and thinking about having effective home exercise programs. So I'm going to outline some of the strategies that you can put in place that are really evidence-based for increasing adherence to independent practice, like home exercise programs. So don't give people 10 things to do. That is an absolutely key thing. You will get much higher adherence. And the first time you do it, give somebody one thing to practice, so they can really nut away at doing that one thing, get a lot of reps of one thing and see change in that one thing. And maybe you can add on a couple more, but the message here is don't give people 10 things to do. You're actually going to get much higher adherence with much less. So not lots of exercises. Individualized, obviously, so that it's really it's about that person and the things that they're trying to work on. So if you are using one of the big programs like GRASP, pick out the ones that really help to target that person's particular problems. What exercises are really related to the specific goals that they're working on, and achievable. And this really comes from work done by Tamina Levy, who's an Adelaide-based physio who did a recorded lecture for us. So it sits within our freely available recorded lectures. And in that recorded lecture, she's discussing the factors that influence people's adherence to an upper limb home exercise program. and it's a qualitative study. So she's interviewed people about what factors were very influential. And one of the things that came out very strongly in that work is that a lot of them found the exercises too difficult. And obviously it was really demotivating for them to be trying to do things that they found too difficult to do. So absolutely make sure that they can set the exercise up and that they can do the exercise. Recording practice. Now we know across all types of adherence to doing more exercise of any sort for people with, in cardiac rehab and pulmonary rehab, that recording the amount of exercise that you do is an incredible driver of adherence. So have systems in place for people to record the amounts of reps, not time, but actual repetitions of practice. And have systems in place for monitoring that. So if somebody's gone away to do a home exercise program, the first time you see them again, show me your exercise sheet. How did your home exercise go? How many reps did you get to? So that you're putting that as absolute first importance. Don't, send somebody away and then forget to discuss it or leave it till, the end of the session. So it needs to be seen as that monitoring is very, very important because, and it is important because it creates higher adherence to the program. And prompts and reminders are actually also very helpful too, like things like flicking out emails and text messages to remind people. So when you're monitoring the amounts, but also have systems for monitoring change, because obviously that's going to have enormous motivational value. We'll talk a bit more about that, but really thinking about objective measures, knowledge of results kind of feedback. Okay, we're now moving on to intensity of practice. So this is really thinking about what are the strategies that we can do so that people achieve more reps within a space of time, so that their practice is more intense. And you could see that earlier example from Emma Schneider of the upper limb group, how they completely changed the intensity of practice that people were doing. So what are the absolute key things here? The absolute key thing is that you count and record repetitions and you use target numbers. If you're not counting and recording repetitions, this is the absolute first thing you need to start doing to change the amounts of practice that people achieve. And because it absolutely makes no sense to be having conversations with people talking about how it's important to increase amounts of practice, and that neuroplasticity is dependent on doing hundreds and thousands of reps, etc., etc. If you have that conversation, but you have no idea how much practice somebody is doing, it's not being counted, it's not being recorded, then you're saying it's important, but you're also saying that it is not important because, or your actions are implying that it's not important. And you cannot establish targets. You don't have any systems in place for increasing intensity over time if you don't know what people are doing, if it's not being counted and recorded. So you have systems in place for counting and recording practice. And this really just shows a very easy system. Is you just have one of these tally counters. And so you can see this guy here, he does one repetition of practice, clicks the tally counter. So have an easy system, and really most stroke survivors can very reliably count with an easy system like that. It really that's not additional attentional overload. It just, do a rep, click the tally counter. Or sometimes people might have a system, they might count 10 reps, then click the tally counter. If tally counters are a bit beyond somebody, then maybe just have a sort of system, have some stripes on a paper. Every time they do a rep, they put a strike through it. Every time they do 5 reps, they put a strike through a mark on a piece of paper. But, have a system for counting and recording reps of practice. Now, this is a randomized clinical trial that has not been published, but it was done by some honours students and myself in 2020. It will hopefully get published one day. Actually, if I got around to submitting it, that would no doubt be helpful. But what we did in this clinical trial, which was done with stroke survivors, we went into a very large private neurological practice in Sydney, and in that neuro practice, counting and recording repetitions of practice is not usual practice. So we recruited 27 stroke survivors. We would take one target exercise that we were going to have a look at the intensity of practice of that exercise over 5 therapy sessions. Those therapy sessions were delivered by physios, exercise physiologists, OTs, and allied health assistants. And in the control group, they just did usual therapy. So usual therapy had no counting and recording of repetitions, but we were videoing the sessions. So we were able to get that from the video. In the experimental group, the person delivering the therapy very visibly counted with a tally counter, recorded all the repetitions, and used a target number. And the target number was always a 25% increase from what they had previously achieved for that exercise. Now, the results of that was that the experimental group increased their intensity of practice across 5 therapy sessions. They increased their intensity of practice 120% more than the control group. So it had an incredible effect. The 95% confidence interval indicates that we're 95% confident that that true effect lies somewhere between roughly 40 and 200%. So even at the lowest end of that 95% confidence interval, you've got a difference. The experimental group is 40%. At the upper end, 200% more than the control group. So a very large difference for a very simple and a very cheap intervention, and one that can become part of semi-supervised and independent practice, as well as one-to-one practice. We also measured quality of movement, like on a 10-point sort of visual analog scale. What was the quality of movement sort of at the baseline and at the 5th session? And those videos were observed by somebody who didn't know whether they were in the control or the experimental group. And the change across the 5 sessions, there was no difference between the 2 groups. So in that very big increase in intensity of practice did not lower the quality of movement of what they were doing. So I think what that means, is that we've got an enormous room for movement, that people can be working much, much harder with these systems in place without detracting from quality of movement. And obviously you will hit a tipping point where things become too messy, but you've got a lot of room for increasing intensity before you hit that. So you can see that wide confidence interval spanning both sides of no effect. So really a meaningless difference, no difference on quality of movement. Now, this table shows you the results session by session between the experimental group that had the counting and recording and the control group that didn't. So you can see, if you have a look across the experimental group, they increase their intensity of practice on every one of those 5 sessions. To start with, they're beating that 25% target, and then they do drop below, but they're still increasing. Now, really clinically, you wouldn't use a 25% target. You would use whatever's appropriate for that person and the exercise that they're doing. But to standardize it for the research, we had this 25% target. So that continual increase in intensity that you see there led to that difference of roughly 120% between the 2 groups. The control group are all over the place. They go backwards and forwards, and sometimes they don't change much at all. But I think what that means is that when you haven't got counting and recording or target numbers, you've just got a big mess. People are all over the place. But if you use these systems of counting and recording repetitions and having target numbers, you can have a very consistent increase in intensity of practice. And then obviously you're going to get much more done, or the stroke survivor is going to get much more done then. This is a study that has been published, also done by myself and some honour students. And this study is an experimental within participant design. And in this study, we were working with stroke survivors again, with 24 stroke survivors. And what we did is we followed them across 3 days and gave them 3 different types of instructions to see what effect that had on their intensity of practice, measured as repetitions per minute again. So the baseline instructions, each day they got the baseline, and then they got one of the 3 types of instructions, and that was done in a randomized order across the 24 participants. So the baseline was just do whatever it was. It wasn't all, some was upper limb, some was lower limb, some was plain strengthening, some was task specific practice. But, you know, do you know, pick up the cup or whatever. The instruction A, all it had was a target number, which was always 25. B was 25 as fast as you can. C was 25 as fast as you can, and go for your personal best. Go, 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 go. You know, a bit of encouragement there. And the results, again, are quite impressive. We change what we say, and people work very differently. So if you have a look at here, the first one, so the base, looking at instruction A, the average baseline was 16 reps per minute. Simply giving a target number of 25 already gives you quite a big difference in reps per minute. Okay, so that's target number of 25 only. If we have a look at C, the kind of the biggest instruction was do 25 as fast as you can. Go, 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 come on, come on. You know, a bit of verbal encouragement, you get an absolute doubling of the reps per minute. So what we say can have an enormous effect on the intensity of practice people do. But again, we're, you know, tying it to numbers. They've been given a target number to achieve, and different levels of encouragement there. Okay, so for intensity of practice, I've also put knowledge of results feedback in here, because knowledge of results feedback has enormous motivational value. And if people are going to work hard, then we need to be providing motivation. This is our job. It's not on the person to be motivated. It's on us to make sure that there is external motivators happening there. So if we provide knowledge of results feedback to people every time they practice, not as a kind of an outcome measure that happens every now and then, but every time they practice, and it's an objective measure of performance that is directly related to what they're practicing, and it shows them that they are that they are changing as they practice. So here it could be about how far forward can they move the cup without their arm going into abduction or whatever it is. But you could have a very solid, or it could be on speed, something. So here you can see you've got a very concrete sort of distance here. So as he improves, how far can he get and still maintain his external rotation coming up into forward flexion? So that would be very, very solid knowledge of results feedback for him. For this person, and there was very big changes across a few days of practice in the amount of supination. Again, you could have some measure of the amount of supination that could be provided as knowledge of results feedback. And so we should really be expecting to see that kind of change session by session by session. And if not, we should be asking big questions particularly about dosage. If people are only doing 20 or 30 exercises, then, you know, why would they be changing? You know, really it often needs to be much higher dosages to see some significant change. Or, you know, is it something about the practice and whether the practice needs to be more targeted? But, you know, we should have some objective measures that we see change in all the time. Okay, take home messages of all of that. It's absolutely up to us to increase the opportunities for people to practice. It should not be limited to one-to-one sessions with us, because you know, that is never going to be enough practice. So we need to find opportunities for semi-supervised and independent, and we need to put systems in place that help improve adherence to semi-supervised and independent practice. In intensity, if you're not counting and recording reps, that is absolutely critical thing to start doing, because, you know, if you don't know it, how are you going to start changing it? So you need to really have systems in place for counting and recording reps. And it's very easy for that just to become such a standardized practice in an area. Every stroke survivor always has their clicker. Everybody's got practice sheets. And that's just the way things run. And then you can have target numbers. You can celebrate the amounts of practice people are doing. Target numbers, big driver of intensity of practice, and knowledge of results feedback. So providing motivation for people to really keep sort of plugging away and churning out lots of reps intensively. So if there's things in there that you're not doing, then this is absolutely critical to change what you have in place in your clinical settings, so that people are achieving enough practice in order for them to see change. And we'll be putting in place a kind of a case study activity around intensity of practice that you could maybe use as a kind of a baseline to start to evaluate some change within your clinical setting using some of these strategies.